know us, we're the Behaviours Agency. We're a creative agency, but we're built around behavioural science, behind all the insights that behavioural science has delivered over its 50 years of history. And this session is all about how you and we can use creative thinking and behavioural science to create value. So this session is very much focused around value perception, pricing and promotion, creating motivation as a part of value creation. So we're covering quite a lot of territory. I will probably talk quite fast. The recording will be available, so if you're frantically scrabbling, there might be an opportunity to write it down later. But hopefully we'll get through it and get to some time for you guys to ask questions. For those that are familiar with these sessions, they do tend to involve me doing a lot of talking. If you've seen me before, you might notice I've actually had my lockdown hair cut off. It's finally happened, so don't adjust your screens. That really is me. If you haven't been to one of these before, I'm going to start by just covering a little bit of our way of thinking, the Behaviours Agency way of thinking, because I think it's important to understand how we use behavioural science to shape our thinking and how it plays out in a general sense before we move on to the value stuff. So first of all, from our point of view, we do a lot of work in marketing. We've all worked in marketing for years. All marketing should really be about influencing behaviour, and yet an awful lot of it doesn't have any basis in the scientific evidence of what actually works to drive behaviour, and that's why we think it's important to learn from what's been done. The vast swathes of behavioural science out there, academic studies and so forth, that have told us a lot about what it takes to actually change behaviour. So when we talk about behavioural science, we're talking about the whole field of scientific observation and study of behaviour, including the ways that emotions, environment, and social factors can influence our decisions in the real world. All of our decisions are shaped by those factors. And some of those decisions are to do nothing, and some of those decisions are to do exactly what we did last time. But all of our decisions are shaped by behavioural science and by the factors of emotion, environment, and social factors. And why that's so critical is because all marketing is really trying to influence that behaviour. And it's really about trying to move people from what they would have done anyway to what we want them to do instead. That shift from default behaviour to desired behaviour. And if you understand marketing as being about achieving those things, then you stop thinking about how we can persuade people of a particular piece of information and start thinking about what that information is going to do to change what they're going to do. You start seeing that actually what's important is how can we move people from what they would have done to what they will do if we're successful. And that is about susceptibility to change. The real competition lies in what we would do otherwise, not in who else might be offering a similar thing. So when we think about what a marketing challenge is, it's really about that behavioural challenge, not about an information challenge, because our brains don't even work by processing data. Really what they do in any given situation is they take the data that's in front of them, the situation, the stimulus in front of them, and they compare it with either the thing that's next to it or some past experience. And that's how we make decisions. We make comparative decisions all the time. All of our decisions are comparative. And any behaviour that we want to achieve has to have sufficient motivation. People have to want to do it enough. There have to be sufficient means. They have to be able to do it. They have to have the resources they need to do it. And there has to be a trigger that makes it matter in that moment. And in those three factors lie the secret of how to motivate and how to drive people through marketing behaviour. So I won't dwell on this, but when you think about what it means to shift from desired to default to desired behaviour, the larger the behavioural shift needed, the greater the challenge is for marketing. If it's just something small, like a one-off challenge, like dropping the price on something, for instance, in value terms, that's relatively easy to achieve. But if you want to change people's perceptions over time of you as a retailer or you as a brand, that's a much more involved and much more detailed piece of work to do. So when we think about what kinds of value challenges there are those that work in the moment and there are those that work over the longer term. And those two things actually pull in slightly different directions. So that shift of default to desired behavior, it has to also consider, do we want people to judge this value right now, or do we want to build our sense of value over time? And those two factors are both important in shaping how value works. As I've already mentioned, we don't think logically, we actually think relatively. Everything we do isn't judged objectively, it's a comparative decision. We have to find a mental model to match it against. And often that's a judgment that isn't the greatest. We don't always find the best pattern match, we usually just find the first one. We're a bit more like Alexa, choosing the first best pattern match that we find, rather than a whole page of Google search results to choose from. And our brains work through, our buying brains work very differently when we're actively buying from when we're passively consuming in a market. So when we're actually just using a product, we don't judge how much it costs and how much time it saves us and all those kinds of factors. Actually, all we're interested in is how does it perform as a product. When we go looking for it in the market, we really change how our brains approach it. We're looking for very different factors when we're trying to judge between products when we're thinking about buying them than when we're actually just using them. And those are really important because the motivations matter much more when we're out of market, and the means matter a great deal more when we're in. So in a nutshell, what our approach is all about is finding that structured approach to achieving the shift from default to desired behavior, whether that means influencing by being more motivating, by being more top of mind, or by being easy to choose or use. And those are the three main factors we can put into play to affect any given behavior. And that all plays out very importantly in value perception, because what motivates us to choose a particular product or to look for a particular product in a market, and what motivates us to choose it when we're actually when we're down to the last 2 or 3 products we're considering, can really open to manipulation and really open to influence from very behavioural factors. And really, what value means, what we really mean by value is a balance between what you want, the motivation you have that's driving you to buy this thing, and what you're prepared to give up to get it. So on the one hand, you've got just about knowable elements like the basic need you're trying to satisfy. I need a car, or I need a lunchtime snack, or whatever that might be. And the basic price, the actual cost of the thing in monetary terms, those are just about knowable. But actually, on the motivation side, you've also got a whole load of other factors playing in, like the quality and the prestige and the trust you have for that product and the pleasure it will give you to buy it or to use it. Lots of other factors that weigh in massively to create the value that we're really trying to build in terms of motivation, and an awful lot of other factors besides the basic price on the means side. What your perception of that price is, the other costs you might have to expend to get it, the time, the effort, the risk you might have to take, and also the opportunity cost, the thing that you'll miss out on by choosing that rather than another thing. And those factors below those lines, those are entirely subjective elements. Those are completely open to people interpreting them one way or another. Even something as seemingly simple as price is actually incredibly complicated because it's about our perception of a number, and we do not do well perceiving numbers. So what creating value really means is that the balance between that increasing the perceived reward and reducing the perceived cost. So on the one hand, to increase perceived reward, we can suggest that our product or our service is better quality, or maybe comes with more prestige, or will deliver more prestige, is more pleasurable to use or to buy, is more pleasurable, more trustworthy than whatever the alternative would be. And on the other side, we can think in terms of reducing the perceived cost. Not just in terms of less money, but also that our option is less risky, that it's easier to choose or use, that it's more immediately available, that we don't have to think or wait for the delivery to arrive, that we'll get it straight away. We can play on those factors that are actually costs that we have to incur if we wait, or we take a risk, or we put more effort into things. So those factors all shape the way in which we view value, and as a result, they're all open to the influence of good marketing. What's important to remember is that in many ways, their rewards, the motivation side, goes deeper than the cost, because as I said, what you're looking at when you're looking at the consumption versus buying is very, very influenced by by the costs that you'll incur. So in that sense, you've got those costs are felt when you're actively in buying mode. They matter when we're in a judgmental mindset. Then we're looking to compare on money and time and effort and those simple factors. And those are very influenced by behavioural biases, nudges, and so forth. But at the end of the day, value in that space is really a race to the bottom. Like what you're going to get is people constantly trying to be a little bit better in some little way. Whereas actually on the underside, when you think about what the rewards or the motivations that drive behaviour are, those go much deeper. They're felt when they're out of market, and they matter much more because they occur when we're open-minded, and they are more cumulative, more memorable. That's where value is really built rather than just perceived. And in that sense, it's really important to think about our value as being how we're increasing the sense of reward or motivation that our product or service delivers. So on the one hand, we'll talk first about that, the almost the easy side of that, the stuff that behavioural science is extremely good at delivering for people, and most people are already using. One of my favourite little pictures there of perceived cost being different for different people. I think fundamentally we probably all know a lot of these tricks. We might not have had them codified as such, but there's an awful lot of nudges and approaches that are used as part of natural sales and pricing and promotions that draw on the science of behavioural science. But if you just take even the concept of price, we might think of price as being really simple, but actually our brains really aren't good at processing numbers because we think relatively. So if you put a big number in someone's head, it'll influence what they think about. IKEA are masters of this. Obviously, what they do is they get you to go and commit to a sofa that costs hundreds of pounds, so that by the time you're walking through the marketplace, cushions and light bulbs and saucepans and stuff seem very cheap by comparison. So we're anchored at that high number, and consequently we're not very sensitive to spending on some of that lower value stuff. Because of that, a random number can influence our memory, our perception, our previous expectations, all have a massive influence on how we perceive price. So something will seem cheap if it's in, say, Asda or Poundland, more so than if it's in at the same price sitting there in Waitrose. We're incapable of making those switches. We just assume that because we have a perception of a particular retailer, the price level perception persists across products. Also, whether we think of a product as cheap or premium, if I told you that bottle was Prosecco rather than champagne, you'd have a very different impression of what it was likely to cost. Our coding of what items are massively influences what we interpret in terms of a price. Our understanding is also really important. Can we understand what we're looking at? It's very hard to compare a kilogram amount of value of apples with a per item price, which is quite common in supermarkets. You're sort of trying to choose between the loose and the packed, and you don't know whether you're making a good choice based on 6 of those or 0.5 kilograms of those. It's very hard to make those kinds of decisions. Price variance is important. If we don't have a set idea of, if it's very hard for us to fix on what a price should be, we can't judge whether something is good value or not. The classic example of this is obviously fuel, where the price varies so much that we come to expect. We find it very hard to know what we should be expecting in that context and what looks like good or what looks like expensive. And then the final one is whether price is spread widely across the range. Think about cars. It's impossible to say what a good price for a car is, because prices span such a wide range, even in the new or used market, whichever one you look at. For the price of just a car, it's incredibly hard to say what the price should be. A Volkswagen of a particular size, a Golf of a particular size, perhaps you'd be able to sort of narrow that price range down. But fundamentally, how much should a car cost is a question that's impossible to answer because the range is just too great. So price is not a simple concept, and in most markets, how people perceive the price of a product is entirely shaped by their context and by their understanding of who's trying to sell it to them. So that's a really important consideration in how we consider the way that we shape value. And then if you think about how price performs, how things like promotions perform, we again have very different temptation, very different understanding and an appreciation of numbers based on what we're looking at. So on things that we need but don't necessarily want, we like to spend less. So it's better to perceive that we're saving money on getting what we want for that. Whereas on things that we really like cupcakes, we might want more for the same price. So the same basic deal might come across differently depending on how you pitch it, whether it's something that's functional or more hedonistic. You get more appreciation for getting more cupcakes, and you get more appreciation for spending less on toilet rolls. So how you pitch a deal can be very importantly different based on what kind of product you're trying to sell to people. So controlling that frame of reference is really important to making an item seem good value, making a promotion seem good value. And it's also worth remembering that promotions aren't neutral. Over time, the effect of promotions can be to frame only the lower price as being good value, which means that the higher price, the natural price, must be expensive. And actually, the person who's selling it to you must be expensive. This is something that I think Pizza Express have fallen foul of. Very few people expect to go to Pizza Express and pay full price because they're so used to having a deal to apply there, which means that the price itself and the place itself seem by virtue of that to be expensive, rather than that the deal is great. The deal is just expected, and the real price, the natural price, seems inflated. So the impact of those short-term sales is possibly to erode the overall value. And that is a dangerous position to get into, because obviously that means you become reliant on selling at that lower price rather than bringing people into the market at that price and persuading them that the real price, the natural price, is the one that they ought to be paying. All of these things we capture in what we call our metric system. So this is our bespoke tool for thinking about how the means that people have to spend can be perceived. So we break it down into 6 categories: money, effort, time, risk, individuality, and conscious thought. These are the factors that we instantly judge things on, that our system 1 brains, the fast processing parts of our brains, are able to judge really quickly. So we can make a judgment. Our brains naturally make really quick judgments about how much money or how much effort or how much time or how much risk or how much individuality or how much thought we have to spend on something. So that metric model allows us to look at each of these ones and say, what are people short of in this moment, and what can we therefore play the greatest card on in terms of value? Because if people are short of time, they're more happy to spend money. If they don't want to take a risk, they might be happy to spend more time thinking about it or more effort going further afield. If they're, or indeed trying to follow the herd and avoiding being the only one left out, choosing the one falafel van with no queue rather than the falafel van with a massive queue that tells you that those people know what they're doing, whereas you're completely ignorant and don't know whether that one's good or that one's bad. So people are happier people spend these kinds of means interchangeably, but they're also the means that we naturally process quickly, and so they're the ones that are easily susceptible to biases. So when we want to increase our sense of value, we can play on one or other of these factors in order to suggest to people that they're getting more for their money, or they're spending money and getting more, spending less money and getting more. You can do things like play with an anchoring approach of which one seems like better value. If it's now £50, £50 sounds like a lot of money, but it doesn't sound like so much if you compare it to what it used to be. Likewise, the decoy effect, which allows you to see the better value of £4 versus the £3.50, and you get a much bigger tub for the same for not much more money. Those kind of decoy effects of placing something that seems not nearly as good value make boost the perceived impression of the other one. That's a kind of classic sales technique, which obviously we're all fairly familiar with and maybe even wary of. But these kind of techniques are used throughout marketing. So comparison approaches. So the one in the top left is Basecamp, who list everything you get with Basecamp and compare it to getting it from a whole load of other providers at a much higher cost. So that's a very comparative approach, relative price approach. Obviously, everybody knows the Aldi approach of calling out how much you get versus comparator products at Tesco. But also things like getting people to see the product first and the thing they want rather than the price by using things like Klarna, where you delay that price. And ASOS, who catch people the first time you're there, when you're in that hot state of wanting to buy, and offer you a discount at that point to make sure you go just that go through that last step. So lots of ways in which people are able to tip the balance in monetary terms by just making a direct comparison with a different price or a different moment. Then you've got the non-monetary costs, the ones that don't actually even mention the price, but just you play on our other senses of bias. So social proof. Tell me that other people will do this who I ought to trust. And in that case, it's really putting a number against it. 9 out of 10 designers use this pencil. Or the notion of freshly baked, which makes something feel like there's effort invested in that, as well as being immediacy as well. So you can make things feel more valuable by suggesting that effort has been put into them, or that they'll save you effort, as well as by playing on sense of time. There's also lots of other ways that non-monetary costs are used to build a sense of value and urgency. So 10 people bought this product, there's some social proof coming through. Low in stock, there's some risk that you may miss out unless you buy now. Someone in Paris bought this, so that's a cue that you can follow the herd of buying a fashion item based on a fashionable place, but also just that sense that actually it's popular. And then the classic, obviously, of being able to get it right now, get it tomorrow, the driver of being able to just like make the decision immediately and move on and know that it's coming. So these kind of non-monetary costs build the value straight away in the moment very effectively. And building value in the moment is really critical when people are actually buying. But what it's worth considering is it has no impact in the longer term on the perception of the value of that product. That is all gone at the moment the decision is taken. So what really matters is how can you build a greater sense of value. So increasing the motivation. And this is kind of a critical part of how we approach this type of subject. So We have lots of different ways of approaching motivations, but we use a simple model, which we call the y-axis, which looks at the span from all motivations can be mapped onto this model of fear against hope. So are we trying to minimize negatives of the possible outcomes, or are we trying to maximize positives and reach opportunities, versus are we thinking about ourselves primarily, or are we comparing ourselves to others? And you can map motivations onto this framework. So what you get is, in the bottom corner, you get those that are about security. So thinking about stability or safety or control. And this is about knowing that your needs will be met. So it's answering people's potential fears and concerns for themselves. This is, if you were talking in Maslowian terms, this is that bottom of the pyramid stuff about safety, reliability, confidence, control. A lot of marketing plays into this space without necessarily calling it that, but actually it's about telling people that this is the safe place to be. Similarly, on the other side, still sort of playing on that sense of safety, is belonging. So the feeling of being part of something bigger, a movement, a home, a tribe, or a community. And a lot of motivation is driven by this kind of space. So the sense of identity or home, the sense of being part of a universal movement, a bigger movement than you, and the sense of fitting in with and playing along with a broader pattern of behavior. All of these kind of features are strong in marketing. But above that, on the higher levels, we also can think about whether our product is helping to build status. This is about people comparing themselves to others or winning against the market. So having power, looking good, savvier, those kind of factors play in this space. And on the other side, it's more about that kind of idea. This is the top of that Maslowian pyramid, fulfillment. Judging against your own ideals and values, identifying personal development, self-expression, satisfaction, even pleasure, adventure, those kind of features. So mastering something or enjoying, just plain enjoying it, or allowing yourself to express yourself through it. Those kind of motivations, that basically maps motivations, and most brands can be fitted into those kind of spaces. What is important is what matters in the market, what matters in this context, because for something like grocery, for instance, last year we saw a massive shift from where perhaps people had been driving very much into the winning space and being the savvy shopper who goes to Aldi to get the best possible value out of the market. But when COVID hit, actually people retreated into security and needed to know that they'd get what they needed out of that big shop they were going to do. So they ended up back in Tesco doing a big shop, knowing that the brands that they needed and all of the stock they needed would be there available to them, rather than taking a risk and going into that Aldi space where perhaps they wouldn't be able to fulfill all their needs in that space. So we saw a massive shift in what was motivating people in shopping terms at that point. Arguably, a lot of that's come back, but nevertheless, the behaviours are changing, and some of that sense of why people might choose to make decisions has been shaped by the last year or so. But these are the spaces in which we build motivation. So these are the spaces we build value. If we can identify a way, which of these factors are most influential in our market, we've got a real good chance of building a separate identity there. But quality is really critical to that, because fundamentally what people are looking for in different markets is very different. We all, though, need a point of comparison, and quality is about superiority, not excellence. You could be great at something, but unless it's better than the alternative, unless it matters and it's a motivating factor, it's not going to play in. And actually quality is something that's really very much in the mind of the consumer, not in the mind of the seller. It's easy for manufacturers and retailers to get caught up in their own definition of quality. They might think that being well made or elegantly designed or rich in features is what matters, but in reality, to the audience, it might be more about how easy it is to clean, or how durable it is, or its appearance. And those factors are all need to be discovered and surfaced by the right kind of research. But factors that count into quality can be extremely various, and there's a whole load of them on the right-hand side there. One of my favourite examples of misunderstanding almost of how quality can work for people and what matters in a market is how calorie counts were introduced. When they were introduced in the States, there was a clear intention there of helping people make healthy choices. But unfortunately, when you put calorie counts on a menu, what you can end up with is if people are actually poor and hungry, what they work really well to tell you is what you'll get, what bang you'll get for your buck. So works as a shortcut for quantity, actually telling people that something with a low price and a high calorie count is going to deliver the best bang for their buck, the best value meal available, which means people actually were encouraged to eat badly rather than encouraged to eat well, because their motivators were not about health, they were not about calorie counting, they were about value for money. And in that context, the way in which value works can be really various. It can really matter very much who they're trying to talk to. And it's a really interesting example of how those things can come to life.